Today, I'm going to tell you the story of Emma Branagan, a young woman who volunteered as a nurse at the Battle of Gettysburg, where she faced horrors beyond imagination and moral choices no one should have to make. As cannons thundered and thousands of men fell, she found herself holding the life of an enemy soldier in her hands, a man with critical information that could save lives on both sides, but no one expected what would happen. Please subscribe to our channel and comment where you're listening from. The Calling, Philadelphia, June 28, 1863. Emma Branagan wiped the sweat from her brow as she folded the last of the bandages. The air in the Philadelphia Ladies' Aid Society hall hung heavy with summer heat and the urgent whispers of women preparing for what everyone now feared was coming. A major battle, perhaps the largest of the war. They say Lee's army has crossed into Pennsylvania. Worthing, entering the hall with a newspaper clutched in her gloved hand. The society president's voice carried across the room, silencing the 20 women at work. The governor has called for 50,000 volunteers to defend the state. Emma's hand stilled on the clean white cloth. She thought of her brother Michael, serving with the 71st Pennsylvania. Was he among the Union forces scrambling to meet the Confederate invasion? Will they reach Philadelphia? Asked a timid voice from the corner. Let us pray they do not, Mrs. Worthington replied grimly. But we must be prepared. The Army Medical Department is desperately understaffed. They've requested additional nurses to travel west immediately. Emma felt a pull in her chest, a sensation she'd come to recognize over 2 years of war. The same feeling that had drawn her to volunteer with the aid society while other young women continued their the same instinct that kept her working late into the night, preparing supplies for men whose faces she'd never seen. I'll go, she said, her voice stronger. The room fell silent. Mrs. Worthington studied her with narrowed eyes. You've never worked in a field hospital, Miss Branagan. I've nursed my father through consumption and my mother through the fever that Emma. At 22, she had already seen more death than many twice her age. I have steady hands, strong stomach. This will be different, who had served briefly. The suffering, it cannot be described. Then I will learn. That evening, as Emma packed her small valise, her father watched from the doorway of their modest home, concern etched in the lines of his face. You don't have to do this, Patrick Branagan said, his Irish accent still strong despite 30 years in America. The Army has doctors, nurses. Not enough, Emma replied, carefully placing a small Bible atop her spare dress. And fewer still who will treat the men as more than broken bodies to be patched up or discarded. Her father sighed, running a hand through his thinning gray hair. Your mother would be proud. Worried sick, but proud. Emma paused, touching the cameo at her throat, her mother's final gift. Do you think so? I know it. He stepped into the room and placed a small leather case. This was hers. She'd want you to have it now. Emma opened the case to reveal a set of sewing needles of various sizes, each nestled in its own slot. Some were curved, unlike any she'd used for mending clothes. She was a midwife in the old country, her father explained. Saved many a woman and child with those needles. She'd have taught you had she lived. Emma ran her finger along the fine steel instruments. I don't know how to use these. You'll learn, he said, echoing her earlier words. You have her hand, her heart, too. Dawn found Emma at the Philadelphia train station, alongside 3 other women from the Aid Society. The platform teemed with soldiers and civilians, the air thick with coal smoke, and rumors swirled through the crowd. Lee's army was marching on Harrisburg, no, on Baltimore, no, directly toward Philadelphia itself. We're bound for Gettysburg, Mrs. Worthington informed them as they boarded. The Army is establishing a supply depot there. We'll report to the medical director upon arrival. The train lurched forward, steel wheels grinding against the tracks. Emma watched the city recede, then vanish as farmland took its place outside the window. How strange that just miles away, men were preparing to kill each other among these same peaceful fields. The journey west was tense and uncomfortable. At each stop, more passengers crowded aboard, mostly soldiers heading to join their regiments, their young faces a mixture of determination and poorly concealed fear. Emma offered water from her canteen to a boy who couldn't have been more than 16, his ill-fitting uniform hanging loose on his thin frame. Thank you, miss, his voice cracking. Are you a nurse? Yes, Emma. though the word felt presumptuous. What did she know of battlefield medicine, of amputations, extractions, of comforting men as they faced their final moments? "I'm glad you ladies are going," the boy said, handing back her canteen. "My brother was at Chancellorsville, said the nurses there were like angels." Angel. Emma almost laughed. She was merely a seamstress's daughter with steady hands and a stubborn sense of duty. No angel, just a woman doing what needed to be done. As their train approached Gettysburg around midday, Emma noticed increased military activity, cavalry patrols along the tracks, artillery batteries being positioned on hilltops, supply wagons clogging the roads. The small Pennsylvania town was transforming before their eyes into a massive military encampment. The train whistle shrieked as they pulled into the station. Through the window, Emma could see dozens of blue-uniformed officers hurrying, shouting orders that couldn't be heard over the hiss of steam and clatter of arriving troops. "Ladies," and said as they gathered their belongings, "steel yourselves. Our work begins now." They stepped onto the platform into controlled. A harried-looking officer approached, consulting a clipboard. "Ladies' Aid Society? Thank God. Follow me. We're setting up at the seminary west of town." As they hurried through Gettysburg's streets, Emma was struck by the town's dual nature. A quaint farming community transformed into a military headquarters. Civilians were boarding up shops, loading wagons with possessions, preparing. Soldiers were everywhere, digging entrenchments, unloading supplies, establishing defensive positions. "The Confederates," says Abernathy. "Scout reports place them less than 10 miles north and west," cried grimly. "General Reynolds has moved to engage their advance elements. We expect casualties by nightfall." The Lutheran seminary stood on a low ridge overlooking rolling farmland to the west. Its brick buildings, normally home to theological, now swarmed with medical personnel unloading crates and setting up long. Miss Branagan, a tall man with spectacles and a harried expression. "I'm Dr. William Hammond. You'll be assisting me. Have you any medical experience?" "Limited, sir," Emma admitted, "but I learned quickly." Hammond studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You'll have to. When the wounded start arriving, there won't be time for lengthy instruction." He gestured to the tables being arranged in rows. "Help prepare the operating station. Clean linens, instruments laid out, water boiling. You know what to do?" "Yes, doctor," though her stomach tightened with apprehension. As she worked, arranging surgical saws and more suited to a butcher's healing, a distant sound reached her ears, a deep, cussive rumble, like summer thunder. The sky above, clear blue. "Artillery," said a nurse beside her, her grim. "It's begun." Emma looked west toward the sound, toward fields where men were now killing and dying. The rumble grew steadily, punctuated occasionally by the sharper crack of massed rifle. The first wounded arrived an hour later, men with relatively minor injuries who could walk or ride back from the front lines. As the day wore on, the trickle became a stream, then a flood. By sunset, every available space in and around the seminary buildings was filled with, and still they came. Baptism of fire, July 1st, 1860. Evening. "Hold him down." Emma threw her weight across the soldier's chest as Dr. Hammond worked to extract a bullet from the man's shoulder. Blood pulsed between the doctor's fingers, splashing onto Emma's apron, already stained beyond recognition after 12 hours of surgery. "Almost there," Hammond, probing deeper with forceps. The soldier, barely more than a boy, screamed through the leather strap clenched between his teeth. With a grunt of satisfaction, Hammond extracted a misshapen lead ball. "Arteries intact. You're lucky, son." Emma released her hold as the soldier sagged into unconsciousness. "Will he keep the arm?" "If infection doesn't set in." Hammond dropped the bullet into a basin with dozens of others. Next was always a next. The battle's first day had proven catastrophic for Union forces. General Reynolds was dead, shot from his horse while rallying his men. The Union line had collapsed north of town, sending soldiers and civilians fleeing through Gettysburg streets with Confederate forces in pursuit. The seminary had become an island of blue uniforms in a sea of gray as the Confederate Army occupied the town. Only the tacit agreement to respect medical facilities had prevented their capture. "Miss Branagan, water," a nurse called from across the room. Emma grabbed a fresh bucket, weaving between makeshift pallets, covering every inch. Men moaned in the dim lamplight, calling for mothers. Why, God? The July heat turned the air into a miasma of blood, sweat, and gangrenous. "Easy now," helping a feverish artillery officer drink. His legs ended in bandaged stumps below the knee. "Did we hold?" he asked, gripping her wrist with strength. "The high ground south of town, Cemetery Ridge. Did we hold it?" Emma assured she had no idea. News from the battlefield reached them only through the wounded, each with their own fragmented. "Thank God," the man whispered, releasing her. "If they take that ridge, we're finished." A commotion at the doorway drew Emma's attention. Two stretcher-bearers struggled to bring in a new casualty. "Confederate officer," one announced. "Found him near the railroad cut. Still breathing? Barely?" "Put him in the corner," snapped the head nurse. "Union men take priority." Emma bit her lip but said nothing. The brutality of triage had been her hardest lesson, choosing who received care first, who might wait, who would be left to die. Military rank, severity of wounds, and yes, which uniform a man wore, all factored into these grim calculations. As the night deepened, the pace of new arrivals slowed. Emma took her first break in 14 hours, stepping outside to escape the stifling heat and smell of death. The night sky blazed with stars, indifferent to the human suffering below. To the south, occasional flashes illuminated the horizon, artillery fire, as armies repositioned under cover of darkness. Tomorrow would bring more killing, more maimed bodies delivered to their doorstep. First battle? Emma turned to find Dr. Hammond beside her, offering a canteen. She accepted it gratefully, the tepid water washing away the copper blood from her mouth. "Is it that obvious?" "You've done well," his voice softening from the brusque tone he in surgery. "Better than most with formal training." "I don't feel I've done well, Emma. So many died under my hands today." They would have died regardless. At least they weren't alone. Hammond took back the canteen. In the moonlight, Emma noticed the deep lines etched around his eyes, the silver threading his dark beard. He looked far older than his probable 40 years. "How do you bear it?" quietly. Hammond considered this. "I focus on the next patient, the next procedure. I count those saved rather than those." He gazed toward the battlefield. "And I remember that every man who dies on my table might have taken a dozen more lives had he remained in the fight." A cold calculus, but perhaps a necessary. "You should rest while you can, Hammond. Tomorrow will be worse." "How can you know?" "Because neither side achieved its objective today. The Confederates failed to dislodge us completely, and we failed to hold our initial positions. That means they'll try again with everything they have." Hammond was. Dawn brought a brief, tense lull, soon shattered by renewed artillery fire. The battle shifted south, focusing on the high ground the artillery officer had mentioned, Cemetery Ridge, and the hills beside it. By noon, the seminary hospital had reached capacity. New casualties were diverted to other field hospitals established in nearby farms and churches. Emma worked mechanically, her mind detached from her hands as they cleaned wounds, held limbs for amputation, spooned water and broth into parched mouths. "Miss Branagan." Dr. Hammond appeared at her elbow as she finished bandaging a chest wound. "I need you in the back room. Special case." She followed him to a small storage area converted into a private surgery. On a table lay the Confederate officer brought in the previous night, a captain by his insignia, though his gray uniform was so darkened with blood that rank was barely discernible. "You want me to assist with a Confederate?" Emma asked, surprised given the triage priority. "This isn't just any officer," lowering him. "Based on documents found on his person. He's a cartographer who was mapping Union positions before he was wounded. He may have vital intelligence about Confederate plans." Emma studied the unconscious. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with a strong-boned face gone pale from blood loss. A bandage wrapped his head, dark hair matted with blood visible at the edges. "He has a depressed skull fracture," Hammond explained. "I need to elevate the bone fragments before they cause permanent damage to his brain. It's delicate work, and I need steady hands to assist." "Shouldn't this be reported to Union officers?" Emma asked. "If he has intelligence, I've sent word," Hammond cut her off. "But my duty as a doctor comes first. This man will die without surgery, and with him, whatever knowledge he possesses." Emma nodded slowly. Whatever uniform he wore, the man before her was someone's son, perhaps someone's husband or father. Her place was not to judge who deserved care, but to provide it. The procedure was unlike anything she'd assisted with before. Hammond worked with extraordinary precision, first shaving and cleaning the wound area, then carefully drilling a small hole in the man's skull to relieve pressure before gently lifting the depressed bone fragment. "Perfect," Hammond murmured as Emma handed him each instrument before he needed to. You have a surgeon's in. Hours later, as Hammond placed the final suture, the Confederate officer's eyes fluttered open. They were a startling blue against his blood-drained skin. Where? He whispered, confusion clouding his. Union Field Hospital, Hammond told him. You're a prisoner of war, Captain. Sorensen, the man supplied weakly. Thomas Sorensen, Army of Northern Virginia. Captain Sorensen, you've suffered a serious head injury. You need to rest. The Confederate tried to rise, but fell back with a groan. I must report to whom? Hammond asked casually. General Lee. A flash of suspicion crossed Sorensen's face before pain overwhelmed it. I need water. Emma brought a cup to his lips. As he drank, his eyes locked with hers, clear and intelligent despite his injury. A guardian angel, he murmured, in a Yankee hospital. God has a strange sense of humor. Before Emma could respond, shouting erupted from the main ward. Hammond rushed out, returning moments later with a grim expression. Confederate artillery is repositioning. They may be preparing to target the town directly, including the hospitals. We need to evacuate critical patients. He glanced at Sorensen. He stays under your watch, Miss Branagan. If Union intelligence officers arrive, fetch me immediately. With that, Hammond disappeared to organize the evacuation. Left alone with the Confederate, Emma felt suddenly uneasy. Enemy or not, this man's maps and knowledge might cost perhaps even her brothers. Don't judge me too harshly, as if reading her thought. I never fired a just drew lines on paper. Lines that guide armies, Emma replied quietly. Yes. His eyes closed briefly. Lines that determine who lives and who dies. When they opened again, they held a terrible clarity. I know where the blow will fall tomorrow. Thousands will die unless someone stops it. The choice. July 2nd, 1863. Night. What do you mean, Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Captain Sorensen's eyes darted to the doorway, confirming they were alone. Pickett's division, he rasped. Fresh troops, 15,000 men. They'll charge the center tomorrow. Why tell me this? Emma's hands trembled as she adjusted his bandage. Because I've seen enough death. Sorensen winced as pain lanced his skull. This war has gone on too long. Emma studied him, searching for deception. Confederate officers had been known to plant false information when captured, yet the clarity in his gaze, the resignation in his voice, suggested truth. I should get Dr. Hammond, she said, rising. Sorensen's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with surprising strength. Not Hammond. Union command. Tell them, Cemetery Ridge, direct assault. Lee believes it's weakened. A thunderous boom shook the building, followed by another. Confederate artillery had begun shelling the town. Plaster dust sifted down from the ceiling. I have to help evacuate, Emma said, pulling free. I'll return when I can. The main ward had descended into controlled chaos. Stretcher-bearers moved the most critical patients, while those who could walk hobbled toward wagons outside. Dr. Hammond directed the evacuation, his voice cutting through the din of artillery, panicked men. Miss Branagan, help with the chest wounds, he called, appealing her. We're moving to the church 2 miles south. For hours, Emma worked with helping load steadying those who could walk, comforting those in too much pain to be moved. The Confederate bombardment intensified, shells exploding in the town around them. Fires broke out in several buildings. Throughout the chaos, Sorensen's revelation, 15,000 men in a frontal slaughter, waiting to on both sides. Near midnight, the last ambulance wagon departed. Only Emma, Hammond, 2 other nurses, and a handful of patients too fragile to transport remained at the seminary. Among them was Captain Sorensen, deemed too unstable to survive the jolting journey. We'll move the remaining patient. First light, his face gray. Get some rest. Instead, Emma returned to Sorensen's room. The Confederate officer lay still, his breathing shallow but steady. The bombardment had stopped, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the occasional crack of rifle fire from pickets along the battle lines. Captain, she whispered, touching his shoulder. His eyes opened, clearer than before. You didn't tell them. It wasn't a question. I haven't had the chance, though it wasn't entirely true. She could have mentioned it to Hammond, would have sent word up the chain of command. You're not sure you should, Sorensen. Emma sank onto the stool beside his. Tell them, thousands of your comrades. They'll die anyway, Sorensen. This charge, it's madness. The men know it too. I heard them talking before I was wounded. Then why will they do it? Because Lee ordered it, because they believe in the cause, because turning back now means admitting this was all for nothing. His voice cracked with emotion. So much death already. My brother at Antietam. My best friend at Chancellorsville. Emma thought of her own brother Mike. Was he on that ridge now, preparing for the assault Sorensen described? I became a nurse to save lives, she said. All lives, not to choose which men should live and which should die. Yet that's exactly what we do in war, Sorensen. Drawing lines on maps, giving orders, pulling triggers, all of it amounts to choosing who lives and dies. Studying her. You have someone in the Union Army? My brother, Emma admitted. 71st Pennsylvania. Sorensen closed his eyes briefly. For what? For making this your burden, too. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Emma turned to see Dr. Hammond, his expression unreadable. The Union officers have arrived. They want to... Emma's heart. Had Hammond overheard their conversation? He needs rest, she said, rising to her feet. The procedure was difficult, and moving him... They're not asking, Miss Branagan. Hammond's tone brooked no argument. Please wait outside. 2 blue-uniformed officers entered as Emma reluctantly stepped into the hallway. The door closed firmly behind her. For 20 minutes she paced the corridor, torn between duty to her country and her oath as a nurse to do no harm. If Sorensen told them about the planned assault, Union commanders would reinforce Cemetery Ridge. The Confederate charge would be met with devastating fire. Thousands would die, who might otherwise live if the attack were called off due to forewarning. Yet, if she had somehow prevented this intelligence from reaching Union command, how many of her countrymen might die who could have been saved? The door opened, and the officers emerged. One nodded to Hammond. We'll send men to move him to headquarters for further questioning at dawn. After they departed, Emma re-entered the room to find Sorensen pale and sweating, Hammond checking his pulse with a frown. The interrogation was too much, the doctor. His pulse is erratic. I told them nothing, whispered, finding Emma's. Claimed the injury affected my memory. Hammond looked between them sharply. What aren't you telling me? Emma hesitated, spoke. Captain Sorensen has information about tomorrow's Confederate plan, a major assault on Cemetery Ridge. And you didn't report this immediately? Hammond's voice was dangerously quiet. I was going to, but nothing, Miss Branagan. Men's lives are at stake. On both sides. If Union forces are prepared, the Confederates will be slaughtered. That is the nature of war, Hammond said. Our duty is to our own. My duty is to my patients, Emma replied, surprising herself with her boldness. All my... Hammond stared at her for a long moment. You're relieved of duty for the remainder of the night, Miss Branagan. I'll tend to Captain Sorensen myself. Sir, that's an order. His tone left no room for argument. Emma departed with a last glance at Sorensen, whose eyes held a mixture of gratitude. Outside, she found a quiet corner of the largely abandoned hospital and sank to the floor, burying her face in her blood-stained apron. What had she done? Or rather, what had she failed to do? By hesitating, she might have sentenced hundreds of Union soldiers to death. Yet the alternative felt equally impossible. God help us all. When the cannons fell silent. July 3rd, 1860. Afternoon, the thunder of artillery was like nothing Emma had ever. For over an hour, the Confederate guns had pounded Cemetery Ridge with a barrage that shook the earth and rattled windows miles away. The makeshift hospital, the church south of town, vibrated with each distant impact. Despite Hammond's order relieving her of duty, Emma had rejoined the medical team at dawn. There were too few hands for the work, and Hammond had merely given her a cold nod before assigning her to change bandages. Is it the attack? A nurse whispered as they worked side by. The one the rebel captain warned about? News had spread quickly among the Some viewed Emma as a traitor for her hesitation. Others understood her impossible moral position. I think so, Emma replied, glancing out the window toward the ridge where smoke clouds billowed into the summer sky. According to stretcher-bearers bringing in the morning's wounded, Union forces had indeed reinforced Cemetery Ridge overnight. Whether from Sorensen's intelligence, which Hammond had apparently reported despite the captain's denial to the officer, or from their own observation, the Union commanders expected. What happened to him? The Confederate captain? The nurse shrugged. Heard they took him to the provost marshal's office in town for question. Emma's stomach tightened. Military intelligence officers could be harsh with prisoners who withheld information, especially those suffering head injuries that might loosen tongues. Before she could dwell on Sorensen's fate, the artillery suddenly ceased. The silence was so abrupt, so complete, that every person in the hospital froze. "What's happening?" someone asked. A doctor near the window answered in a hushed voice. "They're coming. God help them. They're coming." Emma moved to the window. In the distance, across an open field nearly a mile wide, lines of gray uniformed men emerged from the trees, regiment after regiment, their bayonets gleaming in the afternoon sun, battle flags waving above them. Pickett's charge had begun. Even from miles away, the sight was both magnificent and terrible. 15,000 men moving forward in perfect formation, as if on parade rather than marching toward almost certain death. "They'll be slaughtered," a wounded Union soldier murmured beside her. "Our boys are dug in with 60 cannon and thousands of rifles." Emma thought of Sorensen, who had tried to prevent this, of the men advancing across that field, each someone's brother, husband, son, of her own brother Michael, possibly waiting on that ridge with rifle ready. The distant crackle of rifle fire reached them, followed by the boom of artillery. The Confederate lines kept advancing, though gaps began appearing where men fell. Soon the field was carpeted with bodies, yet still they came. "Prep for incoming," Hammond's voice cut through her thought. "Heavy casualties expected within the hour." Emma turned from the window. This was no time for moral questioning or regrets. Men would need her skills, her steady hand, her calm presence. The first wounded from the charge arrived as the fighting reached its peak. Most were Union soldiers with relatively minor injuries, those who could be quickly treated and sent back. The more serious cases would come later. By evening, the full toll of Pickett's charge became clear. Nearly two-thirds of the Confederate forces had been killed, wounded, or captured. The survivors straggled back to Seminary Ridge in disarray, their grand assault shattered against the Union defenses. "Lee's army is finished as an offensive force," a colonel told Hammond as his shoulder was bandaged. "They'll retreat back to Virginia now." As night fell, Emma took her first break in hours. She stepped outside the church, breathing deeply of the evening air. Though tainted with smoke and the distant smell of death, it was fresher than the hospital's miasma. "Miss Branagan!" She turned to find Dr. Hammond approaching. His shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Blood dried on his sleeves. "Sir," she acknowledged stiffly. "Walk with me," he said. It wasn't quite an order, but Emma fell into step beside him as he moved away from the church. They walked in silence for several minutes before Hammond spoke again. "I reported Captain Sorensen's intelligence to General Hancock last night." "I assumed you had," Emma replied. "The ridge was heavily reinforced." "Yes," Hammond's voice was heavy, "which likely saved hundreds of Union lives today, and cost hundreds of Confederate ones." Hammond's, "That is the nature of war, miss. A calculus of death that no civilized person should have to perform. Yet here we are." "Is that why you became a doctor? To balance the equation?" "I became a doctor to save lives," Hammond said, echoing her own words from the night. "All lives, but war forces choices." Emma studied his face in the moonlight, seeing the lines of strain and the shadows of too many hard decisions. "What happened to Captain Sorensen?" "He died during interrogation," Hammond said flatly. "His brain began bleeding again, a complication of his injury. Nothing could be done." Emma closed her eyes. Another death among thousands, yet this one felt personal. A man who had tried in his way to stop the slaughter. "He asked for you," Hammond added quietly. "At the end." "What did he?" "To tell you he was at peace with his choice." Hammond sighed. "Whatever that means." Once Emma knew Sorensen had chosen not to reveal the attacks to the Union office, leaving the final decision to her and Hammond, a final act of conscience. Man who had too much. "I owe you an apology. I was harsh last night. You were faced with an impossible choice, one that no nurse, no human, should have to make. Yet we make such choices every day here," replied. "Who receives care first? Who might be saved? Who is beyond help? Yes, but those are medical decisions. You were asked to decide the fate of men on a battlefield. Isn't that what we all do in war? By our actions or inactions, our words or silences?" Hammond had no answer, for they stood in silence, looking toward the darkened ridge where so many had died that day. Finally, Hammond spoke again. "The Army will move south soon, following Lee's retreat. We'll need experienced nurses." It was an invitation, Emma realized. Despite everything, he wanted her to continue. "I'll go where I'm needed." As they walked back to the hospital, a curious peace settled over Emma. The horror remained. Nothing could erase the sights and sounds of the past 3 days, but underneath it lay a certainty that she was where she doing work that mattered. The Battle of Gettysburg was ending. The cannons had fallen, but the war continued, and with it, the need for hands that healed rather than harmed. Inside the hospital, a wounded soldier called out in pain. Without hesitation, Emma moved to his side, taking his hand in hers. "I'm here," she told him, her voice steady and sure. "You're not alone." In that moment, it was enough.